Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and it's always so great to spend this time with you. We have all the latest development when it comes to the escalating US-Iran conflict. As fears grow of wider regional instability, we've seen that happen. We saw the fire missiles between Israel and Iran, and now the latest development is between United States and Iran. We're going to give you the play-by-play of what's happening and where things are today. The G7 summit is just days away, so the world will be looking at what the leaders are up to that are set to tackle trade wars, artificial intelligence, the Ukraine-Russia war, the Middle East conflict, and China. And back home here, the Bank of Canada holds interest rates steady as Canadians continue debating whether the country's heading towards a recession or simply navigating economic turbulence. We're going to cover all the latest details on that. And in the tech world, there is the AI race that is now in overdrive. We have China that's unveiled a $295 billion AI strategy. The SpaceX IPO approaches. We're going to give you the latest development on what investors are looking into. And businesses are beginning to ask questions, very critical questions, where their returns on all the AI spending is going. All that and much more on today's Ymedia Newsroom. Now, on the top story for Canada, we have the Bank of Canada decides to hold rates again as trade risks, inflation, and economic uncertainty cloud the outlook for Canada's economy. Since the Bank of Canada has left its key overnight interest rate unchanged at 2.25% for the fifth consecutive meeting, signaling that policymakers remain uncertain about the path of inflation, economic growth, and the impact of ongoing trade tensions. The central bank says that the future rate decisions will depend on incoming data rather than a predetermined course. Inflation remains above the bank's preferred comfort zone. That's why they've kept the rate steady. Now, the decision suggests that the Bank of Canada believes inflation risks have not disappeared completely, even as Canada's economy shows some signs of slowing for homeowners, businesses, and consumers hoping for lower borrowing costs. The message is clear: rate cuts are not guaranteed. The bank is balancing competing signals. There's two things. There's the 2 quarters of GDP contraction as the economy has not grown, putting it into a technical recession. Then you have the stronger than expected employment numbers for the month of May with 88,000 jobs that were created, and the ongoing tariff uncertainty with CUSMA review just around the corner on July 1st. Those uncertainties are very high to see what that means for CUSMA. And the elevated energy price risks because of the Middle East tensions as the war with Iran continues over a 100-day mark, and the Strait of Hormuz essentially, closed, not allowing the same flow of vessels. It's responsible for 20% of the world's energy, and we've seen energy prices hike within the past 3 months. Now, the Bank of Canada is effectively admitting that it doesn't yet have a clear picture of where the economy is headed. Canada has recession-like GDP numbers, but not recession-like employment numbers. So until inflation, growth, and trade conditions become clear, the bank appears content to stay on the sidelines and keeping the rate as is. Now, the bigger question isn't today's decision, it's whether Canada can guarantee and generate meaningful economic growth without lowering rates. Now, if growth remains weak and tariffs continue weighing on export, and pressures for rate cuts could return later this year. So currently, the policy rate is at 2.25%. It is the fifth consecutive rate hold from the Bank of Canada. And Canada recently posted 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction, which is contributing to the Bank of Canada's decision today. And of course, we saw the latest job numbers by Stats Canada, where it showed 88,000 jobs were created. Now, going on to this escalation between the United States and Iran, President Trump has vowed Iran will pay the price as the U.S. strike sparks new Middle East escalations. The United States has launched retaliatory strikes against Iranian military targets after the downing of a U.S. Apache helicopter near the Strait of Hormuz. President Donald Trump has warned Tehran it would pay the price, are his quotes, while Iran vowed to have a response, raising fears that a fragile ceasefire that started on April 7th and diplomatic track could collapse. We know that for weeks and I guess months now, there was the conversation on having the end of the war peace agreement. And since that's stalled and we've seen the latest escalations, many are wondering what this means for this ongoing conflict. So how did this happen? Essentially, this is what took place. Essentially, the US forces struck Iranian radar surveillance and air defense sites near the Strait of Hormuz. And that happened after the strikes followed the downing of the U.S. Apache helicopter, whose crews were rescued in the Persian Sea. Iran then responded with missile attacks targeting U.S. bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, and other regional locations, according to multiple reports. Tehran says that it will not leave attacks unanswered and has warned of further retaliation. Now, the countries across the region are urging restraint to prevent a wider war. When the U.S. Bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait were hit, I mean, that is what they're asking for it to be restrained and for us not to go back into that war that we saw take place in all of March. Now, the biggest concern here is that, there is military exchange happening. First, you had it between Israel and Iran take place over the weekend, earlier this week, and now you have between the United States and Iran. So this is also going to affect the global energy supply risks, right? If the Strait of Hormuz gets closed down again, then that means we're going to see higher energy prices. That's going to contribute to the inflation numbers as the world looks on, as the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the world's most important oil and LNG shipping routes. You have about 40% of China's energy comes from the Strait of Hormuz, relying on the GCC countries. 75% to Japan, 65% to South Korea. Before it was about 60% to India. So those are very critical numbers of, in terms of the backlash of what it means for those countries that rely on the Strait of Hormuz. And we've seen here in Canada the prices go up prior to this escalation war. At the end of February, the prices of oil was around $1.35. Now we're looking at the $1.80, $1.90 and spikes. The United States is experiencing the same thing with fuel costs above above $4.50 a gallon. So now any disruptions could, push energy prices higher, fuel inflation, and create new economic pressures worldwide. Now, this is becoming a test. It's between what we're seeing, what President Trump essentially starting a war that he doesn't know a way to get out of. A lot of, things have been thrown at him about him being pushed into the war by Israeli prime minister, not really calculating the risks of this fallout. We know that President Trump has tried to close this war up in terms of coming to a peace deal, and he said that, they're very close. Even Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, has said the same thing, but we're seeing that escalations keep erupting. You see President Trump, who's determined to show that, any attacks on U.S. forces will bring immediate consequences. And then at the same time, you have Iran also trying to demonstrate it will not be intimidated and also retaliates. So you have this danger on both sides that could essentially escalate things much further and spiral out of control outside of either one of their control. And then you have Israel, who's consistently, the prime minister of Israel has consistently said that he believes that, this should, go full force on Iran. And we've heard in the past few weeks that there was a difference of opinion between President Trump and Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, in terms of how they should approach Iran. So this is the latest escalation points. And the markets are watching, of course. The markets react within 5% of escalations, anything that's seen. So that's to be seen in terms of, what's to come. Now, the G7 is around the corner. So this is going to be a flashpoint, right? So you have the G7 happening next week in France. And to that, you're going to have the discussions on the trade wars between the United States and some of those G7 countries. You have AI and, how to regulate it, how to govern it, the whole entire conversation on the AI race, AI company IPOs and data centers, and then the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And you have President Volodymyr Zelensky there as well. We're going to go into detail a little bit later on what he's looking to do at the G7 and this ongoing crisis in the Middle East as these tensions will dominate what will take place at the G7 summit. Now, President Trump says that he is attending the G7, and this is a chance that, the other G7 countries will get a chance to talk to him to see what it means on trade, NATO, Iran, and the entire relationship he has, which has been, a little bit tricky, especially with Canada as well, the European Union countries. So President Trump will be the biggest story of the summit. We're going to be watching that. We have Ymedia should be live there. So we're going to bring you the play-by-play of what's taking place. He will be boarding the Prime Minister's plane from Geneva, landing in Evian-les-Bains in France for the G7 summit, and he'll not only be there to ask questions on behalf of Ymedia to the world leaders who are there, but it will also give us the background visuals of, what this G7 location looks like, where is it being held, and so we plan to, do a coverage where you feel like you're there at the G7. So you want to stay tuned with us. That is the big coverage for all of next week. I will be having direct live interviews with Shubi as well from Ymedia to see what's going on, and we'll bring you the latest. But every leader will want private time meeting with President Trump because you have the U.S. tariffs, you have NATO spending targets, right? It's right now 2%. There's talks of going up to 4 or 5%. You have the Russia-Ukraine war, you have the Iran escalations, and the global trade all depends heavily on what President Trump's decision is on how he's going to navigate all of this. So what to watch is President Trump, Prime Minister Mark Carney's meeting. The Kuzma review is just around the corner. We're talking about just a few weeks away, which really is a $1 trillion agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico. This is a $3.5 billion trade that crosses the border of Canada and US on a daily basis. So this is something that we cannot afford to not have renewed for another 16 years. So that's around the corner. So we're going to be watching that. We're going to be watching President Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India and their meeting, and because of the latest tensions that were between the two countries and what it means for their trade. And then President Trump and Macron, their tensions over trade and China is also something we're going to be watching for, and President Trump's position on Iran after these recent US strikes. And essentially, really none of those countries coming to help him as he asked for help to open up the Strait of Hormuz. And if you recall, those countries like Britain, France, and then Germany and the rest of them said, you know what, we didn't start the war. We didn't even know you were going to do this. And that was on February 28th when the strikes happened it was a joint strike with Israel and the United States on Iran, which killed Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran and very high-ranking officials in the Iranian regime. And then the war started, and now we're past the 100-day mark. We've had the Strait of Hormuz closed. And if you recall, President Trump asked for help. He said, help us open it. You guys need the oil supplies. We don't. And to that, you had a lot of pushback. And many will say, yeah, rightly so, because those other countries were not involved in this decision to go into war with Iran. But at the same time, you have a lot of tension that's taken place. There was news reports that, Britain and France sent out, vessels there to help open it. But then you have, the Strait of Hormuz blocked by Iran. Then you have another blockade by the U.S. Vessels, and then you have, those reports that France and UK had sent their own. There's a lot happening in that seaway that we get to hear parts of, and so this is, critical to see. Now everyone's going to be in the same room, so we'll see what that means on this latest development with Iran. Now, my Prime Minister Mark Carney will also have a very big test. as he heads to G7 seeking trade allies as the US tariffs persist. We have the United States saying that regardless of CUSMA being renewed and for another 16 years, and hopefully that happens, but they're saying that there still might be some tariffs that will be applied. And so this is a time where we have the Prime Minister say that Canada's biggest weakness is that it relies too heavily on the United States. 70% of Canadian exports go to the United States, 90% of Canada's oil goes to the United States. So we know that Prime Minister Mark Carney has been, heavily trying to have trade relations with other countries, whether it's India, China, Australia, European Union, and to make those relationships stronger. Well, this is something that he'll get a chance to do when it comes to attending the G7 and to be able to push some of that agenda items forward as Canada remains in a very weak performing G7 economy. Our latest numbers to see that Q4 of 2025, the economy contracted. Q1 of 2026, the economy also contracted, meaning there wasn't growth in GDP. And so, therefore, that's a technical definition of a recession. And then, we saw the latest numbers of employment numbers come out of last month, which looked a lot better, even though the unemployment rate is still, high, especially for youth. So yeah, and Canada's the only country performing so poorly in the G7. And so this is a time for, banker turned to prime minister to be able to show Canadians what he's going to accomplish at the G7 and really starting to see some of the investments on all these trade talks and trade agreements he is striking. So, prime minister does need investments, he needs trade diversification, and he needs support from Europe while still maintaining this very, very critical Canada-US relationship. And what will be discussed also is, of course, the Iran crisis, and we can't say that enough. The Middle East, it affects, Saudi oil, it affects UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, all those oil-producing countries, as well as Iraq. And so this conflict that's been going on now for over 3 months, it's US, Iran, Israel, and then you have what's happening in Lebanon right now. It's a massive humanitarian crisis. 1.4 million people have been displaced from southern Lebanon. It does not look like they'll be able to go back to their homes. And this is the southern border of Lebanon to the Litani River. And that's about 14% of Lebanon's land that right now is occupied by Israeli soldiers. And as the fight with Hezbollah continues, so that is going to be, we foresee that to be a critical thing that'll be discussed. Of course, we're going to ask questions. Our colleague Shubi is there next week, so this is what he will be asking about. And the bigger concerns like oil prices, inflation, Strait of Hormuz shipping, and the global recession risks. Those are all very critical things that we're looking to see how it's going to be navigated and what the input of the other countries will be when they face President Trump. And the elephant in the room, and yes, the size of what it would be is the AI. It's this massive issue that we need to hear from the G7 in terms of what they have in mind, these leaders, as AI race moves to center stage as these G7 leaders meet, and they need to come up with more global rules and regulations, right? Because this is going to impact the globe. It's not going to be something that one country is doing and another country is not doing. And so artificial intelligence is no longer just a tech issue, right? It's not just an industry in the tech industry and that's it. This is now becoming a wider discussion where leaders, these G7 leaders, will need to discuss AI regulations, data centers, energy demands, national security, and what it means for the competition between US and China on this AI super intelligence race. And at the same time, you have the hosting country, France's Macron. He's pushing for China's engagement. And yet you have a split by the G7 leaders on Beijing strategy. So you have France that wants engagement with China. It believes that, you cannot have, any of these discussions without having China at the table. And because China is increasingly growing its influence and obviously its economy. So the US, alternatively also wants tougher measures, right? Because it is a big competition when it comes to the AI race, when it comes to EVs, and everything else in between. So then you have also Japan that is worried about security concerns when it comes to China. And Canada's in a way caught in the middle because, Canada is still sending its MPs to Taiwan. It's got a relationship with Taiwan, and that is against China's One China policy, which is that Taiwan belongs to China, and that is a massive contentious issue. So that's what we're going to be watching out for to see, where how China comes up in all of this and where all these G7 countries sit on China's policy. And the Ukraine fight for attention is going to be evident there. You will have President Zelensky, who will be there to push for support and attention for Ukraine while the world's focus has shifted onto Iran. So, Ukraine wants to remain front and center since this full-scale invasion. And, this has been going on for about 4 years now. And, there has been pledges combined in terms of supporting Ukraine that now in these past 4 years exceed $500 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian aid. $500 billion has been, that's the combined pledge for Ukraine that's been sent to Ukraine. And so like a breakdown of what kind of money, where did that money go? So you have, and where did it come from, most importantly? So you have Europe, the EU, and member states, the European institutions and individual countries have collectively provided roughly $360 billion, right? So that's about 350 billion euros. And this includes a mix of military equipment, humanitarian relief, and large-scale financial loans. The United States has made available around $188 billion in war-related spending since 2022, with approximately $127 billion going directly towards supporting Ukraine's government, military operations, and economic needs. And when it comes to Canada, it has committed over $25.5 billion in multifaceted assistance, which includes over $13 billion in direct financial support and substantial military assistance through Operation UNIFIER. The details of all of these numbers that I'm talking about, these facts and figures of this funding, and how, on the distribution of it, you can find that at the Kiel Institute Ukraine Support Tracker. We have our own Krista Freeland, who was Deputy Prime Minister. She is now there. She's been appointed to work with President Volodymyr Zelensky on Ukraine's economy and Ukraine's strategy. So it'll be interesting to know what this means. I mean, after a pledge of $500 billion, and no end in sight of where this war is going with Russia and Ukraine, it'll be interesting to see what the G7 leaders will say about Ukraine and what they will commit to, because you have all these other things that are now going on with this Iran conflict, which is not just Iran, it affects, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Oman, all of those countries that, Europe and Asia rely heavily, and also Africa, right, relies heavily on fertilizer from that destination. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this comes out, and the trade disputes, of course, and the big strategy and question of AI, which is the future, it is the current and the very near future. So those are all going to be competing for political attention and what it means for investments. So we're going to be looking at what the Prime Minister is doing when it comes to, trade, increasing its partnerships with other countries while still relying, with its relationship with the United States and the Kuzma Review. We're going to be looking at what it means for AI investments, does the Prime Minister of Canada hope to secure at the summit when it comes to AI? And we know that military spending was massive on Prime Minister Mark Carney and some of those acquisitions and RFPs for other countries trying to vie for Canada's dollars on defense spending. So it'll be interesting to see if there's going to be any more announcements on that. And yeah, so you want to stay with us for the G7 coverage for next week. And Switzerland, because the location of the G7 summit is on the border of Switzerland. So Switzerland is deploying up to 4,000 troops to help the summit area. And so this is going to be something that we will be watching. And on big news about the ban on social media. So Ottawa is moving to ban social media for people under the age of 16 years old as part of their digital safety crackdown. And so the federal government, we've talked about this, and here we have it now. It's going to be announced any day. The federal government is going to introduce legislation that would ban children under the age of 16 from accessing major social media platforms unless companies meet strict new child safety standards that are being established by the federal digital regulator. And so you have the ban that targets platforms like TikToks, Instagram, Snapchat, X, and this new online harm legislation is expected, even like as late as today. So we're going to bring you the latest developments. And so the platforms may be exempt if they meet government safety standards. And we've seen that as 70% of Australian teens reportedly still access social media despite similar bans. And that's been part of the criticism on this, that yes, people understand the need for being able to moderate and regulate teenagers' use or children's use of social media and what they're exposed to. But as these, laws are put into place, how do you actually implement them, right? How do you make sure that it's done? Since the latest stats are that, even though Australia has it, a lot of teens still are able to get on social media. I mean, this is what they're actually used to doing now. I mean, I have a niece who's like she's 12 years old, and she's not fully on social media, but she does use a fair bit of social media, even though she's not allowed to post anything. You just, as soon as they have a phone and they have a tablet and they have a computer, and you could try to, as a parent, block some of those sites, but, this is something that they've just grown up with. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it's going to be implemented here in Canada. And, because how does the government control that? It's really going to be up to the parents and the devices children will have access to access social media under the age of 16. Australia, France, Spain, Denmark, and UK are pursuing similar measures. So the goal is very understandable, but the enforcement will remain a challenge. So government can pass laws, they can keep teenagers off social media, and they could try to do all of that, but we'll see what this real battle is about. You have very addictive algorithms. Once when you get on social media, even as an adult, it's, you could spend time without realizing where it's gone. You could spend 30 minutes, an hour, and not realize that you've been, in this loophole feed on the algorithm. And there's notifications and there's autoplay, then there's endless scrolling. And so this is going to be, very critical to see how it's going to be implemented. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.